Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday, November 13th, 2017. I think I forgot to check the calendar. We might be in week 43. I don't even remember anymore of the Presidential Apprentice. I'm getting tired of that joke myself, but it is worth keeping track of these things, at least from time to time. Daily Co's Radio is live, as announced to you just moments ago by Bill in Portland, Maine. Daily Co's Radio live today, Kagro X, that's me. Hi, David Waldman. Wonders, can't we just launch Roy Moore into space? We have the technology, and there's really no reason why we couldn't do that. He's old enough, as you know. He's reached the age of consent where we can send him into space. Roy Moore causing more controversy over the weekend by surviving the weekend, I guess, really is all he has to do to cause controversy. Where are we at in America? This morning, I guess they're doing better at Starbucks. I should have bought Starbucks or some other coffee chain stock or something over the weekend, like I have a savings to invest. But I guess theoretically we all could have bought that, because apparently everyone in conservative America smashed their coffee machines over the weekend. I don't know exactly why anybody would do this, but I'm loving the whole trend of people smashing things they've already bought to show how angry they are with the company they already paid to do this. I mean, Greg, I see Greg has an item about it in his queue for on Skype, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. But the basic story is, I guess, Keurig was advertising on Sean Hannity's show. Sean Hannity spent Friday and the weekend saying, hey, pedophilia is all right with me, because Roy Moore did it, and Roy Moore is a conservative values voter like me, and we're going to overlook it, and it's all going to be okay. And Keurig said, we don't really want to advertise on a show that says stuff like that. And so then everybody smashed their Keurig machines on video and posted it to own the libs. So are you owned? Do you feel, I mean, you likely knew this story. This show, I mean, I don't know whether it's going to get them as angry if those sponsors come to me as if they just leave. I guess they're only concerned with whether or not they leave Hannity. This show, I mean, if that were the case, this show, the only podcast sponsored by Life-Saving Modern Medicine. Yes, that's right. Life-Saving Modern Medicine triggers you guys, so absolutely boycott it. You must do that from here on in. Also, Oxygen. I don't know what else to tell you about who's sponsoring us, but I guess if they leave Sean Hannity, that's all that really matters. That's where we are, everybody. It's been a weekend. I wasted part of my weekend, I think, convincing 4 people that maybe it wouldn't be all that bad if we talked about superdelegates, but I don't think I changed any minds. But Bernie Sanders published really, the same thing over and over again. But a piece in Politico in which he argues some stuff. Although I have to be honest, I don't really know what the history of his arguments in print has been. But I guess I don't know what to make of it. I was pleased, I guess, to see that he was saying in print anyway this time around that he was more interested in more inclusive nominations processes, and was not making, as far as I could tell in this article, an open argument in favor of caucuses, which suck. Although he was saying, and the word caucus comes up, and he's talking about, I guess, firehouse primaries and mail-in caucuses. And I guess, I mean, do we hate all caucuses? We'll ask Armando whether I hate all caucuses or not, or are mail-in caucuses okay, or are they really just mail-in primaries? Why do you have to call them caucuses? Does anybody benefit by calling them by a different name? Anyway, lots of discussion of superdelegates, most of which you have heard on the air here before, but it was interesting. I guess really what was remarkable about the whole thing is during the entire discussion, and I mean, a good dozen or so people engaged directly in it and, asked questions of me. And what do you think about that? And why don't we do this? And don't you think that? And nobody yelled. there really wasn't any serious anger and tension as often marks this kind of discussion in particular. I don't know. I mean, maybe I just have good people in my timeline. But, I mean, I was thanking everybody last night, for having this nice discussion without ever really resorting to the sort of name-calling and anger and recriminations that usually mark that sort of discussion. And I didn't mean by it thanks to the people who had the discussion pleasantly and screw the rest of you. I mean, everybody who engaged in it. It was a good sign. And I don't know. I mean, it's anecdotal evidence, and surely there's enough remaining animosities out there, and people do fight, but it was a good thing. Usually you can't wade into that discussion, and I knew right away I was getting myself in trouble. And then the trouble didn't materialize. So I don't know. It's like, the first, blossom of spring. It could still be a hard frost and kill it all, but it was a nice thing to see. We could discuss that, of course. Lots of interesting points came out of it, but I think we'll probably focus on the other stuff today. I will take a look at what Greg has got lined up for us. And in addition to the Keurig coffee maker, I don't know what to call it. Is it a controversy? I don't even know. But Roy Moore is still around. They actually did spend the weekend saying brilliant things like, maybe it's not so bad, or some 14-year-olds look like they're older. Oh my God. Or, somebody tweeted out that some 14-year-olds, the phrase he used was, are impossibly flirtatious, which I guess we should look up in the Twitter advanced search just to figure out which weirdo was willing to say that out loud. People do mess up. They say some dumb things, and we can discuss some of the dumb things I have said over the weekend as well. But I thought the impossibly flirtatious thing, like, I hope you just meant impossibly like in general superlative terms, as opposed to like, no, I literally do find it impossible to ignore the flirtations of certain 14-year-olds. Please don't say things like that. We knew going into the weekend, though, that all of the excuses that Roy Moore was making were useless to him. I mean, the storyline belies all of his nonsense about having the parents' permission, and he's intentionally blurring the lines. I think he would tell you if you pressed him on it in court. Oh, I was talking about these girls who were 16 and up. I had the mother's permission. It was the 14-year-old, though, that he picked up around the corner, which everyone knows is the hallmark of having secured parental permission. I asked your mom, but I still want to save on gas. So you're going to have to meet me around the corner, and then we'll go out on our date to my tar paper shack in the woods. Whatever. And then after we're done, we'll write angry letters about the advance of technology. That was a different guy. He was in... Where? Montana? I don't remember where the Unabomber was hanging out. But in all the terrible things the Unabomber ever did, I don't recall anyone ever saying that he thought that there were 14-year-olds who were impossibly flirtatious. So the Unabomber's got a leg up on Roy Moore, and they may send him to the Senate anyway. Good morning, Greg Dworkin, calling from Connecticut. How are you?
Good morning, Roy. Morning.
Roy Moore. It's a beautiful, crisp morning for all of us.
Yeah, don't you think?
It's impossibly beautiful and crisp. I can hardly resist it. It is 14 degrees outside, and I'm so excited. I don't even know.
And that's not Celsius. That's 14 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's right. I like them old-fashioned.
Right. As Brian Schatz pointed out this morning, and I add, defending Nazis and child abusers is bad.
It is hard work.
Also, I add slave owners. These are not things that you really want to be in a position of doing.
No. It would be bad if you did. There's a lot of muddying of the waters going on, but I mean, there's a lot of outright, a lot of teenagers are hot stuff going on. This is the own influence, I think, of the alt-right, where I think they're literally trying to.
You have to defend it, so therefore let's normalize it. I mean, that's what they do with Trump and all of that too.
I guess so.
And also, it's just well worth discussing about norms.
Yes.
Not Norm Ornstein and the other norms, but just norms, and how you don't really want to have them changed.
Yeah. I don't know what they
because
think
we're
doing out
conservative, you and me.
Yeah, ultimately, we sort of are in that respect. A lot of
make the argument all the time. You're a snowflake. Actually, I'm more conservative than you are. I really think that you should stand athwart history and say stop.
It looks that way. I mean, if this is the progression of history, then yeah, I'd like to see it stop.
By the way, Amanda Turkle has a interesting tweet here. A new book sent to me, she writes, photos of some of the ugliest stuff from the Trump rallies. It's called Look Away, documenting the crude and sexist items from the Trump campaign.
Huh. I saw a lot of that.
And yeah, we did see a lot of that, so that sort of fits into this conversation.
I never thought to make a book out of it.
For our readers who are very technically inclined, and you will immediately understand this conversation having to do with, for example, the difference between magazines and other ammunition cages.
Oh, yes,
but hebephilia is the proper term for people like Roy Moore who chase teenagers.
Oh, I didn't know what I saw that pop up, and I was like, "What is that?"
Exactly. Nobody's heard of hebephilia, and often the dividing line is like 13.
Right?
13 and under versus 14 and up. It really has to do more with whether or not you're in puberty or not.
I see.
These are all DSM-5 psychiatric technical terms here. However, the common term used is pedophilia, even though technically we don't know about, maybe there's other cases without, he's really a hebephile. But nobody uses the term because nobody knows what it means, and you can't really have a conversation about it, so pedophile is what we use. He's like a child molester. He is a predator, and that's really the most important part of this.
Yeah, I think if we're going to draw lines and say that there's a thing like that's statutory rape or whatever, then you might as well. There's really no point in drawing shades.
I call it a distinction without a difference.
Yeah.
And people start getting upset. Well, it's technically correct. That is what my definition is of a distraction. That's why I thought from the gun discussion you would totally understand this argument. Look, he's a predator. And if you want to satisfy yourself that hebephilia is the proper term to use and want to convince the media and everybody else having this conversation that that's what they should say, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, you hear urban legends anyway about like what happens to people who end up jailed for pedophilia, and I'm sure that they're like, no, stop hitting me. It was hebephilia. Right, okay,
yeah, exactly.
Sure,
makes a big difference. Sure, okay, right, yeah. Anyway, not a good thing, but the fascinating split in the Republican Party to me is the difference between if he did this, he has to go.
Yeah.
And if he did this, so what? Basically, that's the difference between the rest of the country and the Alabama Republicans.
Ah.
Now, it's not as it's bizarre, but it's not totally as bizarre as it sounds. And I want to give you an example of that. And let me just give you the link so you can find it easier. This is from JMC Analytics, and they did polling on this over the weekend in Alabama. It's a landline poll with all of the
it's Alabama. Of course it
short falls that something like that might have. So it's not a perfect poll by any means.
Okay.
But what they polled is firstly the top line, which is Alabama Senate race. Jones 46, Moore 42.
Oh, yes.
With 9% undecided in a three-way. A three-way having a really interesting connotation here.
Help me.
Jones 48, Moore 44.
Moore 44. More for
and McBride 2 with 6% undecided. If you include leaners,
McBride. Okay, I mean I don't know who that is.
You can go on for an hour on this. I get that, but I'm just reading to you what the numbers are. So 46-42,
yes.
4-point lead for Jones. Except if you include the leaners, then you have Jones 48, Moore 44. But the point is, it's really like a 6-point swing over the weekend after the Washington Post story broke. Now, Alabama is very much in favor of Donald Trump, although perhaps not as much as you might think. His current approval rating for Donald Trump is 52 and disapprove 41, undecided 7. So it's not stellar, but, it's a majority. And then if the special election for the U.S. were held today, would you prefer vote for the Democratic or the Republican candidate? Notice they used the word Democratic, not vote for the Democrat Party, right? So, Democratic 47, Republican 45 as a generic, and then if you add Jones and Moore, then you get those numbers. Now, 31% of Alabamians think that Doug Jones, also known as Atticus Finch, is a liberal. Okay. 26% moderate, 5% conservative, and 37% undecided. Do you think Roy Moore, given the campaign he's run so far, do you think he's qualified to serve as a U.S. Senator? 47% said yes, 43% said no, 10% undecided. But that's down, that's a 4-point difference. It used to be 50-35.
Oh, okay.
So that's a big swing against Moore.
All right.
Okay. And then here's the really, really interesting question. Given the allegations that have come out about Roy Moore's alleged sexual misconduct against 4 underage women, skipping the hebephilia term there, are you more or less likely to support him as a result of these allegations?
Oh, yes.
More likely, that's M-O-R-E, more likely to support Moore, 29. Less likely to support Moore, more or less, 38. And no difference, 33. Okay. And you look at that and say, wait a minute, you're telling me that if you knew that he was having alleged sexual misconduct against 4 underage women, 29% of you are more likely to support him.
Yes. That is apparently.
And you look at that and you scratch your head and say, what is that about? The charitable interpretation is, I don't really believe these charges, and I'm more likely to do it because I think you're smearing them.
Right. And that's.
But that's not the complete picture. And we know that because they've interviewed heads of the local Republican, equivalent of their town committees there, county Republican people who are on the record. Daniel Dale did a great summary of calling like 14 Republican local leaders around the state, got 4 on record, and the other 10 didn't want to return his calls. And the 4 who were on record said things like, even if he did it, I'd still vote for him because he's better than a Democrat.
That's what they say.
That's what they say. And so even if he did it, you'd still do it. So I'm looking at this number and saying, not all of them are thinking it's just because they don't believe it. They would vote for him even if they did believe it. And why is that? And the answer is, without smearing anybody or saying bad things, is when they then ask the follow-up question, would you describe yourself as an evangelical Christian? Yes, 58, no, 27.
I see. Okay. Not really okay. But I get you. I see what you're saying. I don't know why you're saying it, but I see what you're saying.
Well, but it's here. Even the question, as an astute reader points out, given the allegations that have come out against Roy Moore's alleged sexual misconduct against 4 underage women, a 14-year-old is not a woman.
That's true, too.
16-year-old, the age of consent in Alabama, I think, is 16.
Yes, that's
I don't
what
know
I heard.
whether it was or wasn't 14 at the time.
It wasn't.
Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's illegal, and they're not women. They're still kids. And I think that that's an important point here that just gets glanced over. So you have all of this, and you scratch your head, and then Alexander Marcotte, CNN senior national correspondent, Alexander tweets this: former Deputy DA Teresa Jones, who worked alongside Roy Moore, tells CNN it was common knowledge that Roy dated high school girls. Not high school women, high school girls. Everyone we knew thought it was weird.
It is. They're right.
We wondered why someone his age would hang out at high school football games in the mall.
He loves consumerism.
You read that and you go, yuck, right? You have, recoil. Right. But it doesn't stop there. Here's the flip side. On Meet the Press, Senator Toomey from Pennsylvania says it raises the question about the credibility when someone waits for 40 years. That raises the credibility of the accusation itself. In other words, I don't believe the victim.
That is what he said. It does not raise that question, by the way. But okay.
What's that?
It actually does not raise that question.
Doesn't raise that question at all. I mean, first of all, from a technical point of view, I don't know if there's a statute of limitations. And secondly, there's a huge number of reasons, especially when at the time, and this is such a well-reported and documented story.
Yes.
This particular person told contemporaries. So it isn't as if they shouldn't tell anybody until just yesterday.
Right.
She told people at the time, but there's so much pressure to not come forward in cases like this that it shouldn't even need defending, but apparently to somebody like Senator Toomey it does.
Yeah, well, Senator Toomey really did not do anybody any favors, or mostly himself. But yeah, that's a good point too. Like, it raises, even if it did raise credibility by not coming forward for 40 years, it's not the case that she didn't come forward. It's that she didn't tell you until now. She told people
exactly.
she trusted.
And why did you need to know? I mean, and there's so many other issues involved with this. So again, you have a split in the Republican Party now between the if it's true, leave. If it's true, so what? And then there's a much, much smaller third group, which includes Mitt Romney, John McCain, Bob Corker, who basically said, listen, he wasn't qualified before this. Let's be clear.
Right.
Which, by the way, is exactly right.
Yes, that's true, too. He was unqualified and really should have been unacceptable based on all the things he's said as a politician on the public record. Meant
right.
for
also
people to
his
judge
actions
him
as a judge not
yes.
enforcing the Constitution. We have a number of reasons why this would be true. Now, what does it mean for Alabama? Well, the poll comes out and Moore has lost support in this poll, and Jones is running a credible race, is a good candidate for Alabama. Could he win? Yes. Will he win? That's totally unclear. And the reason for that is you can't go by this poll, for example. It's a single poll. And also, there's this thing called differential non-response. That's where embarrassed Roy Moore voters don't want to answer the phone.
Right.
And they won't talk to you. And so you get a skewed view because they're not really telling you. At the same time, Moore wasn't all that popular in the sense that he's lost races down there in the past. And there are a lot of people in Alabama who really think he's a clown. And the question, of course, was, well, will they vote? They voted in Virginia last Tuesday.
Yeah.
Will they vote in Alabama next month? Will the non-Roy Moore people come out? You can interview all the Roy Moore voters you want, and they'll tell you they're not changing their mind. That's sort of not the point. The point is, what about everybody else? You got to go find somebody who said, I wasn't a Roy Moore voter. I wasn't thinking of voting in this primary because I just gave up and shrugged my shoulders, but now I'm voting. I mean, are there voters like that? And so we're not really going to know unless there's an election. I say unless because that is not the response that we've gotten out of the Republicans in Congress. To their credit, just about all of them outside of Senator Toomey have not taken that position of trying to defend Moore. In fact, they've pulled their endorsements. They've worked behind the scenes to cut off money from joint fundraising stuff. They've tried to figure out how they can get him out. They can't because they're relatively powerless, and the grassroots Republicans in Alabama and other places can't stand D.C. Republican leaders anyway. That's why McConnell's ratings are so low. It's not because Democrats hate him. It's because Republicans hate him. So they're limited in terms of what they can actually do. But they're still trying to do this anyway. And one of the tools available to them, apparently, and I'm not an expert on Alabama law, is that this whole election is set by the governor.
Yeah, that's what.
So the governor can move it.
Yeah, a lot of states have it that when there's a vacancy in the Senate, the governor gets to not only nominate a caretaker to occupy the seat, but declare essentially how long will they fill that role. They can say there will or won't be a special election. If the regularly scheduled general election is upcoming, they sometimes just go to that. But otherwise, they can schedule a general election so that the voters get to, fulfill the promise of the 17th Amendment and elect their own representative in the Senate, and they set the date. So I guess if it's up to them to set the date, they could reset the date or unset the date.
Or just whatever. Do some administrative tweak to make it that they feel like they have justification. Luther Strange is still senator, right?
Yes.
He lost the primary, but he didn't resign.
Right.
What if he resigns?
then I guess that's
something different happened. Now I'm going to have to just think about everything and reset it. Sorry, but circumstance and situation has changed.
Well, that would. I mean, I guess you could do whatever you want at that point.
You can do whatever you want. I mean, it's just a question of what fig leaf you decide to put there. But that's one of the tools that they have available. I don't think that this is necessarily going to happen. I don't think it's necessarily good for democracy. I don't even think it's necessarily going to change the outcome. But it's a tool.
That's right. And so is Roy Moore.
Well,
I just thought I'd have to say that.
And in fact, you did.
It's too late now. There are a couple of things I did not say.
You can't take it back. It's on tape. Before. And everybody's going to hear you say that later in the day. I'm just pointing it out. So.
Okay. I'm gonna
So speak before you think.
Okay, right. I think I'm going to say it again.
And remember all that, kids at home. Just speak before you think.
Right.
So the whole idea here is that all of this is incredible. I see a tweet from Andy Slavitt, who of course is our healthcare expert, putting pedophiles in context is now trendy on the right.
Oh, I thought you were going to say in Congress.
No, it's just but I'm just pointing out that the use of the term pedophile for this is pretty rampant, and that's basically the discussion you're going to have. So let's not get distracted about the technical terms here when that's not the point.
Right. Okay.
So how do you justify it? You have Dinesh D'Souza. This is a great one. I was lukewarm on Roy Moore until the last-minute smear. Now we must elect him to show the Washington Post sleaze attack failed. You were always for Roy Moore. Come on.
Yeah, that's
dumb stuff.
Likely true. And
right. In our moment before we go on break, Eric Erickson, I have a hard time taking seriously the outrage from people screaming age of consent who think a 3-year-old boy can identify as a girl and there's nothing wrong.
Yeah,
Talking about mixing apples and oranges.
Right. Well, here's something. Buy stock in rope companies because everybody's looking for extra to hang themselves with. All right. Well, we'll be back after our first break. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching Kagro X or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Everyone here in the production facility is over the age of consent, I believe, and so we can move on. I think we could move on probably from this story, unless there's anything else that needs to be added or there are new allegations.
There's always more.
Oh, there is. We can't get rid of them.
You can't get away from it. So David Horowitz writes, in my view, this is on Twitter, Moore is guilty as accused, but 1, it happened 30 years ago. 2, he can't be removed. Actually, it happened 40 years ago. So he's wrong, so you're disqualified in this discussion, David Horowitz.
Sucker.
He can't be removed from the ballot. And electing a Dem strengthens a party that defends these criminals, Obama, the Clintons, Holder, Lynch, Abbott, and Cheryl Mills, and their crimes are far, far worse.
Gotcha.
Okay, so you got all of that, and this gets to something that I wanted to talk about a little bit, which is the scratch your head and saying, okay, what is it about the Democratic Party in Alabama that makes them anathema to all of these evangelical voters? And my first thought, of course, is, well, maybe it's like the 3/5 thing.
Oh, yeah, maybe.
Because the Democrat Party doesn't accept that 3/5 is correct.
I see.
They were on the wrong side of the war, that kind of thing.
Right.
But I'm told it's really not quite that, or it's not just that, although that underlies a lot of stuff. But rather, there's a whole strain of evangelical Christianity that puts a lot of emphasis in older men, younger girls. And part of the reason for that is authoritarianism. Part of the reason for that is grooming.
Yes. Right.
Which is picking somebody at a very young age and then basically gaslighting them so that they obey the way you want. You get to create the fantasy that you always wanted. Right. And people might think this is really icky and that's not fair and that's painting a lot of people with the wrong brush and all sort of stuff. But let me just tell you a couple of Storify pieces I have here by some very interesting people. This first one here, and I don't have it on my list that I send you every morning as I do it on the fly, so I'm going to put it right at the bottom so you can get to it easy.
Everything should be on the fly.
Everything should be at the bottom.
All right.
So, but everybody should be average.
Really?
Okay. But only in Lake Wobegon is everybody above average. Sarah Posner on evangelicals believe the victim or the accuser. You might find this illuminating about how some evangelicals think about powerful men preying on girls.
Yeah.
And it's a piece that was written at Talking Points Memo about the Duggars.
Oh, my.
Right? Because that's the world that this comes out of.
Yeah.
So, that's the context. Inside the Duggars' deep ties with a once powerful, now scorned ministry. And this is Sarah Posner herself writing back in September 10th. 2015. So she references that and says, a couple of years ago, I wrote a story about sex abuse by the powerful leader of a conservative evangelical ministry. And that's the piece that she's referring to. The women did not talk to a journalist lightly. They had internalized years, in some cases decades, of shame, self-blame, and self-doubt. As the spokeswoman for one of the women who spoke to the Post said, going public about this does not in any way enhance her life. The subject of my story, the evangelist Bill Gothard, was 80 years old when decades of abusing women and teenage girls finally brought him down, but not even completely. You see, men like him and more are seen as authority figures that women are expected to submit to. Yes, submit. That's the word.
Yeah.
Okay, and here's a little snippet. Leigh had been raped as a child, and Gothard counseled her personally about it. The counseling, she said, consisted of blaming her for being raped, because she wasn't wearing modest clothing, had lustful thoughts, and didn't cry out to God to stop her rapist. He told me the sin, the pain I felt in my heart over the years, was because my sin in it. So he had me confess my sin for being raped as a child.
There you go. Good job.
He would groom, and this is the counseling.
Yeah.
That Josh Duggar was sent to have for the year that in between when the family found out and when it became public.
Right.
He would groom young women, sound familiar? And get them to come work for him. One told me of the grooming and that Goddard wanted to counsel her about her rape as a child, and that's the little snippet I read to you. Gothard's homeschooling materials, widely used by homeschooling families, included the Duggards of 19 Kids and Counting fame and taught this about sexual assault. Gothard's philosophy on sexual assault is detailed explicitly in his publications, including the Wisdom booklets. When a woman is attacked, one booklet reads, she's to cry out for help. The victim who fails to do this is equally guilty with the attacker. A document Gothard sent to ATI families, Lessons from Moral Failures in a Family, purports to be a teenage boy's meditation on his sexual assault of his sisters, which he blames in part on his mother for allowing his sisters to run naked after a bath and asking him to change his sisters' diapers, something that would not have occurred if the family had only applied Levitical law.
I am silent.
This is the background, okay?
Yes.
So you ask these voters, who are you going to vote for? And they say, I can't vote for a Democrat. They don't believe in this stuff. So whatever Roy Moore did or didn't do, you're asking me to vote for one of us or not one of us. Right. And I can't possibly vote for not one of us.
Because values.
Now, recall that Josh Duggar's fall from grace was a result of revelations he had sexually abused his sisters.
Yes.
Gothard's take on this may be one of the most extreme views, but certainly the idea that women, and even teenage girls, who are not women, invite their attackers is more commonplace than you'd imagine. Teenage girls are not women. Just say it until you internalize it. Or that they'd lie about it, or conspire with liberals to lie, or conspire with the media. So when you ask, will evangelicals abandon more over this? Some will, but Trump admitted assaulting women and still 81% of white evangelicals voted for him.
Yes.
White evangelicals remain the strongest base of support. So, don't believe me? Read this. This is from Religion News. It comes down to a question of who is more credible in the eyes of the voters, the candidate or the accuser, said Jerry Falwell Jr. The same thing happened to President Trump a few weeks before his election last year, except it was several women making allegations, Falwell told Religious News Service in an email. He denied that any of them were true. and American people believed him and elected him the 45th president of the United States. In a follow-up email, Falwell noted Moore's denial, saying, and I believe the judge is telling the truth. Also, don't underestimate Bannon's role here. He knows that he can manipulate existing anxieties on the Christian right, that they are under siege by secular liberals to fulfill his dream of blowing up the GOP and American politics along with it. Here's what he told me about that. So this is Bannon. This is why evangelicals were the key to Trump's victory. They provided the numbers that the alt-right lacks. Steve Bannon, Trump's most influential strategist, knows the nationalist coalition alone isn't big enough to ever compete against the progressive left, which is why he made a point of winning over the religious right. If conservative Catholics and evangelicals just want to focus on reading the Bible and being good Christians, there's no chance we could ever get the country back on track again. The alt-right supplied Trump with his agenda. The Christian right supplied him with his votes, very much like George Bush W.
Okay. Yes.
Which is how he won re-election. In other words, he knows how powerful the spiritual warfare narrative is in the Christian right, and he's going to do everything he can to manipulate and capitalize on it. So you see the weird, horrifying, perfect storm here. Roy Moore is the GOP's most extreme, outspoken example of Christian right moralist warrior, and yet Bannon has swooped in to undergird his persecution claims. The GOP's in turmoil. Moore has long been a hero to the Christian right for standing up to big bad government liberals, secularist gays, trying to order him a godly judge around. And the gay part of it cannot be, it's abortion, but it's also gay rights. And this is what you hear at the pulpit every Sunday in terms of why the Democrats are evil. I think people don't appreciate how embedded that admiration is and how knee-jerk the reaction of liberals out to get Roy Moore again is. But I add, that's with his voters.
Mm-hmm. Right.
In other words, you can't expect his voters to abandon him. It's everybody else. Just the same discussions we have about Trump. Peel off 10%, you lose. It's not that you expect unanimity, that everybody's going to desert him. It's not going to happen for reasons stated. Still, Sarah writes, it's hard to imagine this is the hill the national GOP wants to die on, but lots of things have been hard to imagine since, say, June 2015.
Right. True.
Okay, and by the way, Moore has spoken at the law school founded by Gotthard.
Law school? All right.
Yeah. A speech on the moral foundations of law, and gives references.
Moral foundations. Okay.
This is the strain of evangelical voters that are supporting Moore, and why they're not going to peel away. Again, that's never the question. Well, of course his voters are going to vote for him. They're going to vote for him even more. Well, okay, fine. What about everybody else? Again, same discussion we always have about Trump. It's not just about his voters. You're not trying to convince that particular strain of voter. They ain't going to be convinced. And they're not going to be convinced by you. It's everybody else. So Atticus Finch is running against him. You're going to vote for Finch, or you're going to vote for this guy? We'll see.
Okay. Well.
Anyway, so that's the background. I just thought that was all fascinating.
It is. It's true. It's another one of these weird, as she says, perfect storms in which there's just enough, I don't know what you would say. I mean, I guess the cover of the religion is enough. And I mean, it doesn't just happen in religious circles. It's in a number of secular circles as well, that the interest in controlling young women and young girls finds justification in all sorts of things, whether it's religion or if it happens to be in Hollywood, fame, fortune, and stardom. All sorts of excuses are given. And we unfortunately, this week in particular, we find it everywhere.
Right.
Wow. It's always been there.
So,
it's just we're finding it now.
I'm one of those people that sort of likes to understand the opposition.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I read all these stories about Trump voters and, in this case, Moore voters. I'm just trying to figure out what the heck is going on in their head, because this is so bizarre. But, you know, that's part of the explanation there. And so, again, there's an ick factor, but at least you need to know what's going on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's not much you can do about it when you're talking about people who begin with the premise of, well, God says so. And I mean, you can't argue with that. You can, but in their heads, you can't. And then, of course, step two is, and this person who's well respected in this religious community must surely know more about what God has to say than I do, because I have no idea. And then
Right.
from
Meanwhile,
there,
I have this fun read. Let's change the subject a little bit about
Okay.
the real world, going back to the real world, New York and Washington. Ha ha ha.
them.
That's not the real world. Alabama's the real world. Real America.
Unfortunately, in many ways it is. Okay.
In many ways it is. But anyway, back to the artificial construct of New York City and Washington, D.C. This is a piece in Vanity Fair by Emily Jane Fox. And the title is, quote, "They're in a world of crap that I substituted," end quote.
Oh, yeah. All right. I know this
Ivanka and Jared's first year in Washington has not gone as expected.
Unless you're me, in which case it has gone as expected. It's not them.
A year after Trump's stunning election, the administration has 0 legislative wins, a looming investigation hanging over their heads, and Jared and Ivanka have a pretty erratic family member boss to deal with. And New York isn't looking much prettier.
Yeah. So what are they
Of
going to
course,
do?
well, Jared's working the phones and Ivanka's working the phones. Ivanka's worried about her reputation, and Jared's worried about whether he's going to be indicted.
I
That's
guess
basically
so.
what's going on here.
How did Ivanka get left out of this Asia trip?
I think she's too busy working on her reputation and didn't want to be seen standing next to Duterte.
That is
Or-
unusual. I'm
Well,
surprised.
she's probably the savviest of the group there, which isn't saying much because of Barcelo.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, all right. Did she opt out or they push her out? I was curious about that.
President Trump himself has repeatedly reminded the couple of what a nice life they had in New York before they were getting killed by the president of D.C. Their old life in New York, of course, no longer exists for them as it did. Many of their one-time friends stepped away from the couple as they jumped in headfirst to support her father and his policies. And few have rushed back to them. Kushner himself noted to Forbes after the election, friends and business associates of theirs had not been enthused by Trumpian values, though he called it exfoliation on his part of former friends who didn't have a lot of character.
I see.
They also happen to be staring down the barrel of an investigation led by Mueller and several congressional committees into whether the Trump campaign colluded with Russia in the 2016 election, and if members of the administration obstructed justice by firing former FBI Director James Comey. Kushner met with several Russian officials during the campaign transition, and though he has denied collusion, Kushner has also turned over documents to Mueller's team about his involvement in Comey's ousting. So they're in a world of crap, said one of the people close to the family. He may seem cool, but he's sweating, and she's like her father. She'll never acknowledge it. We'll blame the media, but she's been working on her reputation forever, and now it's going to suffer horrifically, and for what? So interesting article there in terms of what's going on there. And then I have this Politico piece to follow, which I think is just fascinating. It's by Darren Samuelson. It's called What Mueller's Organization Chart Reveals About His Russia Probe. Workload for the special counsel's team, now 17, shows how he's conducting probe and what may come next. And it's basically how you with such a far-reaching tentacle of an organization and claims against them, including collusion, how do you deal with this? And it's basically to break up the problem into small pieces so that individuals can be assigned to those pieces. One person might be assigned to Manafort. One person might be assigned to Flynn. Right. Others might be about fact-checking in general about specifics, like who spoke to which Russians and so on and so forth. And so it's a nice article about how you go about making the complex at least simple enough for humans to be able to deal with without having a ultra-fast computer to try to do all this stuff for you.
Yeah.
So it's a reminder that probe can actually grow if it needs to. They can hire more people if it turns out they discover stuff that they need to. And they also make the point in the article that you don't need more than 17 so long as people are cooperating. If you start to see the probe, double or triple in terms of numbers of prosecutors without knowing what they're doing, and that's the only thing that you get reported to the press, then take that as a sign that people aren't cooperating.
Yeah. I guess that's a good point. Not cooperating.
They're hot on something. Now all of a sudden they're having all these other people. Actually, what that means is they're not cooperating, so now they need more people.
Right.
Because then you have to build a case, despite their
cooperating.
Cooperation, this is what's happening.
Okay. The targets, to be clear, are the ones who are not cooperating. They can do this with 17 at the moment because everybody that they're bringing in for questioning is rolling over and giving them what they need. Is that what we're talking about here, or versus?
Yeah, something like that. Because, for example, this is all speculation.
As opposed to the prosecutors not cooperating among themselves, and then they're
Right. No.
help.
It's the marks here.
Yes.
So it's the perps. If you think about Manafort in a vacuum, Manafort and his
I would love
his
to think about
protege Gates, right?
Yes, put them both.
But when do they come to trial? And speculation is it's in about 6 months.
Mm-hmm,
So
okay.
you bulk up your staff in order to handle that trial work. Well, if they're cooperating, you don't have to. And if they're not cooperating, then yeah, you do.
Yeah, and if they're really cooperating, you might not even need a trial staff.
That's what I'm saying. So, the more cooperative they are, the less you need to bulk up your staff. If you see them bulking up the staff, it's just a tell that not cooperating need help.
Right. Okay.
Have to build a case. So I just thought that was fascinating in that regard.
I would tend to agree. It's good tea leaf reading, I think. Can't be sure of it, but it's good practical knowledge from practitioners, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm. And then, again, changing subject, here's a good piece. This was posted at 3:15 a.m. So if you ever wonder where Andy Slavitt is at 3 a.m., it's over at USA Today.
Oh.
Obamacare verdict is in, but will Trump let GOP scrap repeal? Okay, so GOP efforts over the last year to repeal the ACA and President Trump's very public efforts to sabotage it were on the ballot in more ways than one. 4 major repeal votes in Congress and repeated efforts to cut funding and raise premiums are very much in Americans' minds as they voted in some key states and as the nationwide Affordable Care Act open enrollment period begins. I will remind you that in Virginia, healthcare was the issue on the ballot.
Yeah,
even more than traffic in Northern Virginia, believe it or not.
That is hard to beat.
Yeah. In Virginia, exit polls show that healthcare was far and away the most important issue at 39%. Democrat Ralph Northam, now governor-elect, took the reasonable position we should be fixing, then building on the Affordable Care Act's coverage. Exit polls showed him with a 77 to 23% advantage over his opponent on the issue of healthcare.
Okay.
For all the talk of race and immigration, terrorism and trade, and I would add Confederate statues, healthcare security carried the day, and the repeal candidate did not. Big strike against repeal. In Maine, even more direct test, and of course Mainers passed a desire to expand. LePage is still fighting with them as far as I know. One interesting interpretation of that vote is far more Mainers voted for it than are set to directly benefit from it. That's strike 2 against the idea Americans want to see the ACA repealed. Okay. And then finally last week, the law that Trump had repeatedly termed dead opened its 5th season with a bang. Outpouring of demand was a massive vote for the ACA. Enrollment in the first few days set records, increasing by 79% over prior years. Every major metric released by the Trump administration was up significantly, representing something beyond what they might in normal years. They come despite a calculated and methodological effort to push premiums higher, decrease awareness, raise assistance, and so confusing. Why? It turns out the rhetoric out of the Trump administration's basically is lying.
Yeah.
There are affordable options. People are taking it. And my sense is that a good number of Republicans understand last week was a strong signal of things to come, would be happy to have health care repeal behind them. Keep that in mind when you hear the arguments about whether or not the individual mandate's going to show up in the tax bill.
True. All right.
Last item was me adding it, so you have to put that in context as well.
Okay. Yeah, it was a very interesting week for the launch of the open enrollment period, and it provides an opportunity for Trump to declare victory and just say that instead of the lie that didn't work very well, that Obamacare is dead, there's no such thing anymore, etc., he should he should take his cue from Jimmy Kimmel and simply say, this is it. What you're signing up for now is Trump care. I don't know if did you see his bit? Somebody sent me.
I did not. I tend not to watch that stuff.
Yeah,
I look at it the next day, but I haven't. Nobody sent it to me, so I didn't see it.
Yeah, that's how I get to see it. It was sent to me. So his bit was. So,
I'm old. I can't stay up that late.
His bit was, I've been fairly critical of President Trump and the Republican efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act. As you know, somewhat famously, I said it was really, a rotten thing to do, and you got to have health care there for people who have pre-existing conditions, et cetera. So, he got a lot of attention for that one. And so he said, but I try to be a reasonable person and keep an open mind, and so I have left myself open. I said, at least let me find out what is being offered by President Trump under Trump Care. And guess what? The plans are actually pretty good. So I encourage you all to go to the Trump healthcare website that's being maintained by the government, by the Trump administration. Log on to healthcare.gov and take a look at the plans that are being offered, and you'll find that they're separated into different levels. The more expensive plans that cover more stuff, the gold plans, there's silver plans, there's even bronze plans if you can't afford really top-notch healthcare. But I looked into it, and the premiums are pretty reasonable. The coverage is pretty good. People who get their coverage that way have a lot of good things to say about it. So congratulations to Donald Trump. I'm glad I kept my mind open about this. And here are some of the emails, tweets, and Facebook messages that I've gotten from conservative fans of Donald Trump who are so glad that I have had so many good things to say about the Trump Care plan. And of course, people are emailing him saying, see, you liberal idiot, you finally realized how good healthcare is under Trump. And of course, we all know that healthcare.gov is, of course, the Obamacare website. It's just that it's still there and people are enrolling in it. And if you just say it's Trump Care, I mean, the door has always been open to that. And I have thought for a long time that he might just do that and just say, you know what, if you're signing up at healthcare.gov, it's really Trump Care, and you're welcome. It's just like I told you in the campaign. Decent healthcare for good, affordable prices. I win. And that might work.
It might work. So with that, I'm going to sign off. Your insider tip for today, expect the HHS secretary announcement later. But for now, this is Greg Dworkin speaking with my very good friend David Waldman Kagro in the morning. Semi-dislocated until repairs are done at Kagro World Headquarters, I assume?
Still hiding in the basement, essentially, because I'm triggered.
One of those basement bloggers. I knew it. I knew it with all the time. Anyway, with that, we have fun because we like each other. That's why we like talking in the morning. So I've overstayed my welcome, as I often do. I've interrupted you a little bit longer than I intended. And I'll be back on Wednesday, and we'll do it again.
Oh, all right. Well, see, that's how much I hated it. Come back again Wednesday and do it again.
All right, take care. Bye.
All right. Thanks, Greg. You take care as well. Yes, I did recently find out that the tile in my bathroom was not forcefully opposed to pedophilia, and so I have been destroying it methodically since then and replacing it with much more supportive and nurturing tile, I guess. It's where we are now. I should make videos of myself saying, I wonder if I could pose credibly as a Sean Hannity fan in doing this and just claim that the tile company was withdrawing its support. Anyway, it was a hell of a weekend. A lot was said, and, I was stuck on the idea of what Senator Toomey said, by the way. I was really surprised that he went and did that. I mean, I know we've all been saying, logically, it's the truth that they are literally accepting the prospect of electing a pedophile and admitting him to the United States Senate in exchange for the promise of, or keeping alive the promise of possible tax cuts. But for Pat Toomey, it's now become, more overt and more direct, really. I mean, Greg mentioned that there were a lot of Republican senators distancing themselves from more, and they were doing it, very gently. The play typically was, well, if true, or worse, I guess I should say, there's if proven true, and there are sort of different gradations of distancing. There's just, I don't want anything to do with this guy, and he doesn't belong, and he's not qualified for the Senate, period. Like Bob Corker is saying, but what's he doing? I don't know. But he's saying, and we've had this discussion before. Do you accept, what you can get out of people or not? Does it raise the permission structure idea? I don't know. And then there's people who say, well, if true, he shouldn't serve, but they don't say whether they think it's true. And then there's, of course, well, if it's proven true, which is a little stronger of a statement, and I think intended to shield them from ever having to really distance themselves from Moore should he win, or if they're asked directly, do you support him in the run-up to the election, they can say, well, if it's proven true, and then they can say, well, in response, say, to a story with 4 women who go on the record by name to make their accusations, and there are 30 additional outside witnesses who say it's true, plus now additional interviews with people who worked with Moore at the time and found his habits, 1, strange, and 2, very clearly suggestive of the practice of pursuing girls and underage girls at that in some cases. But that's not proof. They mean, well, if he's convicted between now and when he arrives in Washington, D.C. to take his seat in the Senate, then I would say, well, he ought to step aside. But hey, if he disagrees with me, what can you do? So there are varying gradations of it. But Pat Toomey just went all the way to attacking the victims. And I mean, there's also varying gradations of attacking the victims here, too, we should probably point out. But I guess I would say this, as I did say on Twitter over the weekend. The idea that Toomey raises here, that he says it raises a question about the credibility that as he says, when someone waits for 40 years, that raises the credibility of the accusation itself. And as Greg observed, it is not actually the case that they waited for 40 years. They told people contemporaneously. They just didn't tell law enforcement authorities, on that you might speculate that has something to do with the fact that Roy Moore was a law enforcement authority at the time. And there are other factors that figure into this as well. But yeah, the idea that she waited is not true, and the idea that it raises questions of credibility doesn't really hold true either. I know he likes to think that that's the case, but the idea that it raises credibility is, as I said, a big part of the reason why predators like Roy Moore prefer children. They are more reliably scared into silence by this sort of permission structure for pedophiles, that if you can scare them enough, they'll undermine their own credibility. That's why they like kids. Don't encourage them. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show. It's our short break at the top of the hour. Once again, one of those breaks with no particular purpose, except now to let me sort of gather my wits about me and figure out where I might go next, and also take care of occasional pieces of business that might have been left at the beginning of the show. But yeah, it occurs to me now we're also up against Thanksgiving week next week. And I guess this was a good time for the Rochester station to stop, to drop the show, I guess. Now, in thinking about whether or not I'm going to have enough time to prepare new shows during the break, I am uncertain. However, I guess we could. My big worry about using reruns was we were going to mess up the whole break scheme with Rochester, and I guess that's out. So, as a concern, that's out the window, and we no longer need to worry. But I know you won't like to hear that it encourages me to think about not preparing shows of new material ahead of time. And I don't know whether I will or not. I mean, these days, the news cycle is so short and so crazy, it's almost impossible not to want to create new shows. But we'll see what time permits. And it's been a while since we ran a rerun, and that means it's been a while since I really took any time away from the show and just sort of relaxed and let things catch up. So I don't know. You'll all give me, I'm looking for permission structure, I guess. But I also enjoy making these things and providing new material. So I don't know. We'll see what goes on. But that immediately sprung to mind. Where I was before the break, we were talking about Pat Toomey's unfortunate foray into all of this. And it was, I think, more distressing than just all of that. The fact that he sort of continued and allowed to pass the strange societal construct that we have, whereby predators are able to choose their victims by, with an eye towards choosing those least likely to be able to find the courage or even the possibility of making a report for some years and then using the fact that they psychologically damaged those people against them, which is really amazing. And that took another shape, by the way, over the weekend of people saying, as we discussed a little bit on Friday, people saying, well, she's got this history of divorces herself and financial difficulties as well, which, as I mentioned, was included in the Washington Post story, not because it's actually relevant to whether or not her allegations are true, but because they knew that that was the attack that was eventually going to be coming, that people were going to look into her background and say, you can't trust her because she's been divorced several times and has declared bankruptcy several times. And I had a feeling that they were going to launch that attack, even though that should immediately bring to mind the fact that the President of the United States has been divorced several times and has declared bankruptcy several times. And if you're going to hang your hat on whether or not the bankruptcy was business or personal, I don't think you're going to get any further than distinguishing between pedophilia and hibophilia. But okay, you could try that. But apparently, hundreds of people who are a little more vocal on Twitter than they ought to be did not see this coming when they launched their attacks and said, you can't trust her. She's been divorced several times and has declared bankruptcy. And they walked straight into it. You mean we shouldn't trust people with that sort of record? Okay, I'll make you a trade. And, mostly they ran away from it. And the best you can hope for, is that those people were bots in the first place anyway. And there's no real human being that has to live with the fact that he's that blind to his own partisanship. But we know that that's probably the case. Anyway, there were also other implications of Toomey's saying that this raises a question of credibility. One, it does not raise a question of credibility. Two, the amount of time it takes for people to come to the realization that they need to speak up is as much a function of your having damaged them with your molestation as anything else. And three, what kind of formulation is that? It raises the question. Because I've got questions now, right? If I realize that this idea that Senator Toomey went purposefully on television to advocate is, in fact, one of the big reasons why predators like Moore prefer victimizing children, that raises questions. I mean, congratulations to Senator Toomey for now making me wonder a little bit about what his motivations are for agreeing affirmatively to go on television when the pattern is set, right? Republican senators have already been given the permission structure to distance themselves from Roy Moore. But Pat Toomey says, I'll go on television and not do that. I'll go on television and go the other direction. I'll go on television and defend the man accused of pedophilia. Because it's technically hebophilia, right? No mention of that. He says, I'm going to go on there and do that. And that makes me say, it is a little strange to me, let's just say, that in the middle of a gigantic pedophilia scandal for the Republican Party, Senator Pat Toomey, who's not from Alabama, he's from Pennsylvania, wants to go on television and mount an affirmative defense. That makes me wonder what Pat Toomey has been doing with his spare time. Now, am I saying that Pat Toomey is hiding pedophilia in his own past? No. I merely say it raises a question. So try that on for size, Pat. What do you think of my accusation? What do you think of the grounds from which I'm attacking you now? Does it raise a question that you signed up to be first out of the box among Republican senators to go on television and say, maybe this is okay. Maybe he didn't do this because his pattern of choosing his victims was extraordinarily wise. Maybe this is all right. I wouldn't have been the first senator to sign up for that one, but that's just me. But because it's just me, and it's just me here talking, and I don't even know whether anybody else is listening, right? It may be just me talking to myself, just musing about this. It makes me wonder why you chose to be the one to do that. There are others. He wasn't going to go without defense. You can look on Twitter, look on social media, find it anywhere. Dinesh D'Souza was dying to go on television and mount this affirmative defense, but you chose. And so I'd like to know why. It may be that you just have an overweening sense of justice, and you live the credo of innocent until proven guilty for everyone. I just don't think I've ever seen you do that for anyone else. So, like I said, it raises questions, and that's okay. That's a good enough standard because I just saw you do it, so I know you love that standard. Does anybody know whether perhaps Pat Toomey has something he wants to tell us? I don't know. Anyway, yes, also lots of defense over the weekend of the obfuscating defense that Roy Moore offered, which was no defense whatsoever, by the way. We saw him make the statement that says, this is all lies. None of this stuff happened. These things did not happen. They're making it up. Anyway, it happened over 40 years ago, blah, blah, blah. And literally the same statement where he says it didn't happen, but it did happen 40 years ago, which, as you know, you can't really stick to both positions on that one. So let's make up our mind about that. And also then, of course, I don't recall, or generally he said, I don't recall doing anything of this without parental permission. I got the mother's permission first, which I think we can pretty clearly conclude he was lying with respect to the 14-year-old anyway, who he picked up around the corner. We discussed that extensively. And also the question of, at 32 years of age, which is how old he was at the time, should your quote-unquote dates really need permission slips from their parents? I mean, I got that. I secured that every time. That's terrific. But nobody, I mean, clearly we hear from colleagues who were around him at the time that everybody thought it was strange. But, is the rest of Alabama really going to say, well, 32... 16, that's not a good ratio, but he got the permission slip signed. That's really it. I mean, it's really, you're really talking about literally barely legal, which is a weird sort of terminology that people like to hang on a genre of pornographic production, which is troubling in its own right. And I guess indicative of the fact that we do have a societal issue at stake here. I mean, that would have its own genre means there's a lot of fans of it, and that's troubling all in its own right. Anyway, so I just think, I don't know if there's anything to add to this, except to say that it is also the case that Breitbart, which, as you know, I have told you a couple times, is a sex cult. It is, and we heard over the weekend, we had an opportunity to use that line about Fox News as well, but Breitbart, I don't know, springs more recently to mind. It's a very particular kind of sex cult, I guess I would say. I mean, some sex cults, I assume, are fun for everyone, and everyone can get what they want and get it with the full consent of mature and understanding partners. But there's also this other kind of sex cult, the Breitbart kind of sex cult, wherein you send what you will call now investigative reporters to Alabama for the express purpose of digging up dirt on the women who now accuse Roy Moore, which is odd because, of course, the investigative reporting has really already been done, including the disclosure of evidence that weighs against you, in such as it is, like bankruptcies and troubled marriages, which don't really weigh that heavily against you, but in the minds of people who are interested in attacking the victims in order to save the perpetrator for political purposes, they will often lean on those things. So, yeah, Breitbart is sending to of their so-called investigative reporters to Alabama to dig up dirt on the victims. And, recall also that the Washington Post made it clear that at least one of his accusers, that is Lee Korfman, who was, as she said, 14 years old at the time that Moore molested her, that she grew up to be, among other things, a Trump voter. So, I mean, do take note of the fact, here we are, there's a nice tweet from Peter J. Hassan. Who is Peter J. Hassan? Peter J. Hassan, associate editor of the Daily Caller, which is a disgusting alt-right publication in its own right, and I would say largely misogynist as well. And I wouldn't differentiate much between the Daily Caller and Breitbart, to be honest. Their focus is more clearly, I think, Daily Caller's focus is more clearly, of the two of them, on misogyny. I mean, remember, that's the place that prints stories like the top 10 hottest Republican smoke shows. I love that they go with that bro language, and that Republicans are better than Democrats because the women are hotter, according to their calculations. Anyway, Peter Hassan, even a Daily Caller editor, recognizes what's going on here. You can be a Trump voter, and Breitbart will still target you if you accuse the wrong man of sexually abusing you as a 14-year-old. Yeah, that's actually quite troubling in its own right, and it reveals an awful lot, obviously, about who Breitbart is, or who he was, and certainly what his organization is now. His 14-year-old victim, Moore's 14-year-old victim, is now an adult and a Trump voter, but she told on a man. Now, you're like, as I said, you can be a Trump voter, and Breitbart will still accuse you, still target you if you accuse the wrong man of abusing you. Yes, but think about who this man is. Not only is she a Trump voter, but the man, Roy Moore, is the guy Trump opposed in the primary. But he is a man, and he's being accused, and that's the bottom line. That's Breitbart for you. That's the kind of sex cult these guys are. They believe they're entitled to use women and girls and their bodies any way that they want, and if you get in the way of that, something's wrong with you. You got to be gotten rid of. That's the bottom line of it, right? Trump opposes Moore in the primary, and she votes for Trump anyway, of course, but this is where the Breitbart organization is. It doesn't even matter. We're going to attack you because you aligned yourself on the wrong side here. You are against the man who used you, and we're against your being against that. There's no other way to interpret it. I mean, I guess you could try to say, well, it's not because he's a man, but because he's a Republican man and a Republican candidate at that. But I don't know. I mean, there are plenty of Republicans that they don't seem to support. They take on and fight Republicans all the time, but they don't ever seem to shy away from attacking somebody who's got a public beef of any kind. And it's not fair to characterize this as a mere beef. But even if it is, they still take the side of the man, and that is awfully weird. And although it should be pointed out, they very frequently do not take the side of the Democratic man, if that were the case. But okay. I just think it's important to point all that out. Anyway, lots of other things to look at as well. These two weirdos that they're sending down there to do the digging into the lives of these women who are recalling what happened to them when they were kids. Just another, obviously, I think everybody's made this observation too, but we might as well get on the record. Gee whiz, why do they wait or hesitate to come forward? And the answer is because Robert Mercer's money is going to be used to pay these sleazeballs to go down there and dig into their past and try and find some stupid reason why you shouldn't believe them, even though it's all been laid out there. And they're playing it as an exclusive too. We exclusively found out these various things about these women who are, but they were all in the Washington Post story. Yes, but we are liars, so we're going to lie anyway. Anyway, I don't know. It's all very strange. I guess one other one-off that I would observe is the weirdness of all of this happening at once. I mean, and we haven't caught up with all the people who have since been or since found themselves accused in one capacity or another with sexual improprieties in the past. We didn't discuss much about Kevin Spacey. We didn't discuss much about Louis C.K. I don't know. I don't think that they are as important, for instance, as focusing on, well, people who are making policy, but they certainly have a weird backhanded way of reinforcing policy or societal norms that should be gotten rid of, and nobody should be afraid of saying so just because they are allegedly more liberal in their outlooks or are major political donors or whatever. Misbehavior is everywhere. There's, of course, over the weekend, a strange thing, and maybe here Armando would be interested in chiming in a little bit, but I think I've got your position well enough from seeing you discuss it on Twitter if you're busy for it. But yeah, there's also this correct but oddly applied corollary to all this, which goes that, this misbehavior, this criminal behavior in many cases is everywhere, and it doesn't know ideology, doesn't care about ideology. It's outside of that realm. So, for instance, if it doesn't matter to you, if these allegations being 30 and 40 years in the past for Roy Moore doesn't persuade you that they are no longer relevant, then don't you have some thinking to do, the formulation goes, about what Bill Clinton did? And there's some yes and there's some no to all of that, and the no is just as interesting as the yes. Chris Hayes brought it up, and I think I'm willing to grant him that he did it in good faith. There really is a capacity in which we still accept Bill Clinton in polite society. And there's certainly some exclusion as well, but by and large, I think he still fits fairly well into polite society, and maybe he ought not to. And that's an issue. But the way they put it, this sort of smug assertion that we need to have a reckoning. And I don't know that I agree with that one too much. And maybe I ascribe too much to it by saying this smug assertion. I mean, have a reckoning. We had the most formal kind of reckoning you could possibly have. A public inquiry costing millions of dollars and involving dozens of prosecutors that laid it all out in public, published every gruesome detail of it, and then we asked our political branches, what do you want to do about all of this? And the decision was made. And was the decision driven by politics? You bet. No doubt about it. There's no hiding from that. What about whataboutism? Because that came up too. Armando made a good point about that. Let me hold that one for a second. But okay, so let's say you want to hold Bill Clinton accountable. That's not a bad thing to do. I'm not terribly concerned about that. But does it reflect how much of it needs to be loaded up onto Hillary Clinton's shoulders? There's, on the one hand, the assertion with, hey, he did this, not her. What are you doing? It's unfair. It's even worse if you're worried about his impact on women. Isn't it even worse to then say, well, we're going to hold Hillary Clinton responsible or partly responsible for this? But then, the waters are muddied because at some point you have to ask yourself, well, wasn't there a point at which she knew what was going on and agreed to participate in the pushback anyway? And the answer, I guess, has to be, yeah, there is. And then what do we think about that? And is that disqualifying? And ought we to hold it against her? Is it entirely disqualifying? Is it partially disqualifying? Is it a factor in how you think of her? And I'm sure that I know people who fit all parts of that spectrum. But like I said, Armando also made a very interesting point, which is that, Chris Hayes, I think, was taking his cues from someone else here, and a conservative person, a conservative commentator at that. And I'm not even certain. I don't know whether I put it aside or not, but I thought it was a good observation that Armando had made, which was that this conservative person off of whom Chris Hayes was riffing, had basically said, okay, so, we're overdue for this reckoning with Bill Clinton, etc., and what about him? And I don't know whether they went back to it, although I do see Ann Coulter going back to JFK. JFK had his dalliances, and sometimes they were very young themselves, and it may or may not be true. I don't know all of the stories about that, but early on in this, I also said, do we have to reckon with this for Ted Kennedy, liberal hero? Yeah, at some point, I guess we do. But, as Armando pointed out, there's a large dose of whataboutism in this. And how do I know this, he asks? The answer is that there's no mention of Clarence Thomas in any of this. And JFK, he's dead. And he has been dead for a while. Ted Kennedy, also right now, dead. And dead for some time at that. But okay, he had a long service in the Senate. And we almost certainly... it would be fair to say a lot of the allegations or whispers about him were ignored. And it's true. And in some sense, we could blame society or blame ourselves. Why not? For some of that. But yeah, there's a good point there. Clarence Thomas is still there. He's still serving. He's still making legal policy, if not, legislative policy, and certainly in interpreting all of this. He's got a hand in those decisions every day and has for decades now, and nobody mentions that. Like, I don't know what we're supposed to do about expunging JFK from the record, or expunging the record of Ted Kennedy, or expunging anyone's record who's gone. I don't know what to do or say about what's happened in the past that's, considered legal precedent or binding statute now, but I know what you're supposed to do about it with Clarence Thomas. If you're excising it from the body public, then excise it. On the other hand, we also laid that out in excruciating detail and came to a decision. It was a decision many people came to regret, a decision people might render differently now, not simply because of a difference in the way we think about sexual harassment and sexual assault, but also a difference in the way we think about deference to presidential judicial nominations. That's absolutely true, too. That's also very different. Speaking of which, I guess if we wanted to use this as the jumping off point, and we might as well, we've got to get to some of these other stories. We are, as we mentioned last time, Joan was visiting, still looking at a situation where there are four Donald Trump judicial nominees rated as entirely unqualified by the American Bar Association, including, Talley, is that his last name, who was unanimously voted not qualified. Apparently that's a level of distinction even more rare than simply being found unqualified. I guess only two judicial nominees in history have been unanimously found to be unqualified. But this guy apparently has a record of three whole years since he's graduated from law school. He's never tried a case. He's never done anything in a courtroom, but he's being nominated to the federal courts. And I don't even remember if he might even be nominated to an appellate court, which I guess you could, if you really were looking for some sort of defense, you could say, well, appellate law is very different from trial law, and it might not, maybe it shouldn't surprise you that he's never tried a case, but is an appellate lawyer. But, appeals are, of course, consideration of that which happened properly or improperly at trial, and you'll need to be able to tell the difference between propriety and impropriety at trial in order to decide those cases accurately and fairly. And, they're apparently not doing it. Anyway, lots more to catch up on. We're going to take one more break, and that'll give me a moment to not only play our very exciting music, but also try and put some mental order to all of this, how we will treat the last half hour. Hopefully it won't be about Roy Moore anymore. I'm getting rather sick of the whole subject, although, you can't do too much about it. By the way, kudos, a shout out to Liz Winstead, everybody's friend Liz Winstead, for starting up the very powerful and very viral campaign of tweeting pictures of yourself at 14 years old and saying, this is the picture, the face of a child, not supposed to be dating any 32-year-old men. Very popular, very powerful. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show. Let me see if I can stop this auto-playing video and make sure we don't hear any of the noise in the background. I opened up the Los Angeles Times report about the judge I was just telling you about, just to let you know. Yeah, it is Brett J. Talley, Talley, nominated to be a federal judge in Alabama, of all places, and unanimously rated as not qualified. I guess that he's probably well, even worse. I think he's going to be a trial judge, and you really should know a little bit about trial law in order to do that. He's practiced law for less than 3 years and never argued a motion, let alone brought a case. This is the least amount of experience I've seen in a judicial nominee, said Christine Lucius, executive vice president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which is not the ABA, but that is who he is, and I'll include this in the roundup. We'll try and speed up a little bit here and get to more of the stories that are looming out there, and at the very least, give you some reading material to catch up on. There's lots. There is included among that lot this report, which I picked up on over the weekend. I think this from Raw Story. We'll see whether. I guess it's originally a Politico report, but this one caught my eye, and Raw Story has a knack for putting a more pointed headline and a more concise story on some of these other things here. Trump advisors flipped out, that's in quotes, flipped out when Sean Spicer, remember that guy, revealed he was on forbidden floor of Trump Tower. That's according to the Politico report. What does that mean, the forbidden floor? What are we talking about? Ousted White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer caused a panic among Trump advisors who flipped out over worries that he may have admitted a violation of a federal court ruling. This would be extraordinarily frustrating, I would think, to the Republican Party's lawyers if this goes badly. Check this out. This is according to a new report in Politico. Reporters Annie Carney and Jeff Gerstein report on outreach they received after an oral history was published by GQ magazine on Tuesday of last week. After the interview was published, 4 people who worked with Spicer on the campaign and at the RNC reached out to Politico to express surprise that he highlighted his presence on the 5th floor, which served as the nerve center of the campaign's poll monitoring operation and data war room that day, because party employees, and remember at that point, Sean Spicer is an RNC employee. Yes, he later joins the Trump team in the White House, but he's an RNC employee at this point, right? Party employees were given strict instructions prohibiting them from going there, Politico noted. Why is that the case? Well, we'll continue with the Raw Story piece here. The unfinished, as they say, unfinished 5th floor of Trump Tower was the war room, according to Trump National Field Coordinator and Battleground States Director Matt Mowers, or I'm guessing it's Mowers. It's spelled mowers, like lawnmowers, as recounted to GQ in this oral history, which is, in other words, a magazine article. But okay, it's an oral history. We interviewed people by mouth for this magazine piece, oral history. A group of us gathered on the 5th floor of Trump Tower in what could be described as basically an oversized utility room. Steppians going through key accounts, key counties, Florida in particular, Broward, Miami-Dade, Southern Florida, what's in, what's not. I would say that at least through 7:30, 8 o'clock, it was a very cautiously optimistic view. Is the statement from Spicer that so alarmed the Trump team. All four sources who reached out to Politico to dispute Spicer's account remembered seeing large signs reminding RNC staffers to keep out. Sean Spicer was the communications director for the RNC at the time. Of course, it was a sign you can't miss, recalled one source. It was pretty glaring. At issue is concern that Spicer acknowledged conduct that the RNC worried was a violation of a U.S. District Court order. The order of Judge Dickinson Debevoise, I'm guessing at how he's pronouncing the last name, Debevoise, Debevoise. I don't know how you would pronounce it. Anyway, this judge actually no longer with us. He died in 2015, but he presided over decades of litigation concerning racially targeted RNC voter suppression efforts. That's what this is about. The Republican National Committee signed a consent decree promising to discontinue their practices. Politico acquired an RNC memo filed in the proceedings that was distributed in September of 2016, which demonstrated the legal liability Republicans faced. There are, this memo said, severe consequences for any violation of the consent decree, one of which would be a renewal of its provisions for another 8 years. Read the legal memo. It is set currently to expire in 2017. That would be now, after nearly 4 decades, but only if no violation occurs between now and then. In other words, the RNC has sent out a memo. Don't violate this consent decree by allowing any RNC employees in the polling war room operations on the 5th floor. If you do, this consent decree, which has required us to end certain racially discriminatory voter suppression efforts, and which is finally slated to expire in 2017, could be renewed. Again, it's been in force for 4 decades, and we could face a 5th if any of you jackasses wander into the 5th floor. Sean Spicer, of course, tells GQ, hell yeah, I was on the 5th floor. You bet. No wonder they're calling up and disputing his account. Meanwhile, this thing should be renewed anyway because, as we learned very recently, in 2016 was, I think, the first election in almost 50 years, if not 50 on the nose, that we, I guess more than 50, right? Since the Civil Rights Acts or the Voting Rights Acts in 65, 67, right? All 64 civil rights. These, the first elections in 50 years free from the constraints of the Voting Rights Act because racism is over, everybody. Let's get rid of it. You remember what John Roberts said about it. And then all of a sudden, weirdly, the first time in 50 years, we changed the rules about how we approach voting rights and voting access, and all of a sudden, oh my God, a bunch of states are restricting thousands and even hundreds of thousands of people from voting, and weird, we just elected the biggest racist we've possibly ever had, certainly the biggest racist in modern American history, just in the first election without the protections of the Voting Rights Act. That is very strange. Well, I differ in my interpretation of the end of racism with John Roberts. That probably won't surprise you. Other stories that we want to try and fit in here. Let's take a look around. Boy, there's some other good things that we're going to have to skip for the day, but let's hit a couple of other things. Questions about recent mass shootings looming out there, including the BaptistNews.com. I don't think we've landed on the Baptist News before. But I had to grab their headline once I saw it. Will Sutherland Springs be a tipping point for Southern Baptists and guns? It's hard to believe that there's a tipping point for anybody with guns at this point, considering what we've been through. But as new groups, as will inevitably be the case, find themselves falling direct victim to all this, I guess it's an open question, and Southern Baptists is one we haven't explored. On the other hand, of course, many people have been pointing out for a long time, if Sandy Hook didn't do it, yada, yada. Well, what about this one? What about that one? And of course, I guess if you have to lump on top of them, a guy last month literally built a makeshift machine gun out of parts available on the internet legally and shot 600 people in 10 minutes. That's actually one a second. For 10 minutes, he just kept shooting people. We might not do anything about that one exactly. But Sutherland Springs, maybe. I don't know, maybe. Who knows? What are Southern Baptists going to do? Let's see what they say about it. It's Baptist News. They know better than I do. Bob Allen is the writer. Let's take a quick look. The military-style semi-automatic rifle used in last Sunday's massacre at the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, sells for about the price of an iPhone 8 and may be in stock at a retailer near you. One reviewer calls it a very affordable gun, ready for any mission, love it, mission, right out of the box. Meanwhile, leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention have reached out in many ways to survivors of the rampage that killed 26 men, women, and children gathered for Sunday morning worship in a salt-of-the-earth kind of fellowship, historically and numerically the backbone of America's second-largest Christian group behind Roman Catholics. Convention President Steve Gaines and SBC Executive Committee President Frank Page traveled to Sutherland Springs November 7th to offer personal prayer and encouragement. The convention's North American Mission Board offered to cover funeral expenses for shooting victims. That's nice of them. They didn't all have to do it by GoFundMe. The Baptist General Convention of Texas established an FBC Sutherland Springs Church Recovery Fund to help the SBTC-affiliated church rebuild and recover, while the Southern Baptists of Texas Convention dispatched chaplains. Articles included reminders about church security, tips on how to respond to an active shooter and other potentially dangerous scenarios, coping with grief, how to talk to your kids, keeping the faith in times of tribulation, debate over the value of expressions of offering thoughts and prayers, and the depths of sinfulness within the human heart. Conspicuously absent is any suggestion that lives might have been saved by tougher gun laws, barring civilians from owning weapons of war designed to equip soldiers to neutralize as many enemy combatants as possible in the shortest amount of time. P.S. 600 people shot, right? It's easy in 2017 to forget that a generation ago, right-of-center, moderate, and progressive Baptists not only coexisted, but sought to cooperate in pursuit of a Tower of Babel-like ambition to preach the gospel to every person on earth before the dawn of the 21st century. I did not realize that was their goal, but it seems to stand to reason, right? Differences over the roles of women, theological education, religious liberty, and the separation of church and state, and more recently LGBT issues, are well-documented reasons the groups went separate ways in the 1990s, but the most relevant, and depending on your point of view, perhaps the deadliest, disconnect between Baptists in the United States today may well be over guns. A Washington Post analysis November 6th speculated that the worst church shooting in modern history isn't likely to change evangelical skepticism about gun control laws. Unfortunately, that's probably the truth. Russell Moore, president of the SBC Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, explained in media interviews that unlike other social issues like abortion, he finds no single position on guns that is clearly revealed in the scriptures. Well, gee whiz. That's not going to surprise me, but okay. While not a gun owner himself, Moore says he holds to conservative views on the Second Amendment and hasn't seen any gun control measure that he is convinced would be effective in preventing mass shootings. All right. And, well, the article goes on, but I guess it expresses healthy skepticism at whether or not Southern Baptists are suddenly going to be the ones that change their minds and start the tidal wave. But I guess we kind of knew that. I thought I'd see if there was anything surprising, and maybe there's something surprising buried deeper in the article, but it looks like it's probably not going to shock and surprise anybody to find out that Southern Baptists probably won't take up the banner. Now, also somewhat related here, this is just for your edification. We always want to check in on these things, and we've checked in on a number of times on the alt-right and how they spread disinformation with respect to Trump-Russia, but guess what? They do it with respect to a lot of things. Anything that undermines the ability of Americans to come together as a coherent body politic. Luke Barnes at Think Progress has this piece, this case in point. This is how the far right wreak online havoc after mass shootings. Did you know? White nationalist communities online are incredibly effective, he says, at spreading propaganda, and I guess this includes the defense of their toy guns as well. After every mass shooting, a grim online pattern follows, and now it's probably beginning to dawn on some of you. Politicians tweet out their thoughts and prayers and explain that now is not the time to discuss gun control. Meanwhile, law enforcement slowly updates the media as they painstakingly piece together the timeline for the latest massacre. Meanwhile, online, a flurry of misinformation spreads. Some of this misinformation and fake news is crude, cruel trolling, but there is also a significant subsection that spreads rumors tailor-made to drum up right-wing fears, be it that the shooter was connected to Antifa or pro-Bernie Sanders groups, or that the victims were part of a CIA deep state operation. These conspiracies cloud the airwaves, making even basic agreement about what happened more difficult. Worse, the fringe communities where these ideas are incubated have an extremely high and often misunderstood level of influence on mainstream social media sites like Twitter. After the church shooting in Sutherland Springs, which left 26 dead, patterns of misinformation yet again flourished. As news of the attack was still developing, Texas Representative Vicente Gonzalez, no N in that one, first N anyway, mistakenly named the shooter as Sam Hyde. Every time there is a mass shooting, Sam Hyde's name is circulated in a barrage of social media posts. Another post claimed that the teenage YouTuber Review Bra was missing in Sutherland Springs. He was also allegedly missing after the Las Vegas shooting and after the Manchester bombing in May, after which he posted a video saying that he was in fact alive. These hoaxes have for years thrived on the messaging board 4chan, which was also where counter-narratives began to grow about the Sutherland Springs shooting, just like they did after the Las Vegas shooting. As BuzzFeed's Ryan Broderick noted, one popular thread that was posted there after the Las Vegas attack was called "Control the Narrative, Don't Let Fake News Take Control," and added that it was important to make sure that everyone knew Steve Paddock was a commie, in quotes there. The same attempts to control the narrative were visible after the Sutherland Springs shootings. Some 4chan users speculated that the shooting was an ISIS or Antifa attack. Others that it was a false flag operation. Soon claims that Devin Patrick Kelly was a, quote, radical alt-left Antifa member quickly found their way to Twitter and to the top of Google's search results. These rumors even translated over into the real world. On Sunday, a Washington Post reporter heard women outside University Hospital in San Antonio talking about how the shooting might have been a, quote, false flag, who then proceeded to shove the reporter away when she inquired further. The popularization of these conspiracy theories is helped along by far-right media stars like Mike Cernovich, Jack Posobiec, and Alex Jones. These men have an established Twitter following, but are also well-received online among online far-right communities, making them perfect stepping stones through which the conspiracies can flow. By the way, Posobiec spent the weekend doxing the victims of Roy Moore's predations. Not only, we had their names, so it wasn't difficult to identify them, but he spent the weekend tweeting out photos of them currently and their whereabouts and their jobs and job locations as well, in case anybody just, wanted to do anything with that information. Before anyone knew Kelly's identity, for instance, the shooter in Sutherland Springs, Mike Cernovich tweeted asking whether the shooting was an Antifa terrorist attack. This idea was then picked up by Alex Jones, and InfoWars editor-at-large Paul Joseph Watson joined in. Google's search engine algorithm surfaced the conspiracy that Kelly was a member of Antifa to linger near the top of its search results well after it had been established that he wasn't. As the Daily Beast reported, nearly 24 hours after the Sutherland Springs shooting, Google was still auto-completing David Kelly to David Kelly Antifa. The scope of this problem is examined in a study by researchers at the University of Alabama, Cyprus University of Technology, University College of London, and Telefonica Research. In analyzing millions of posts shared on Twitter, Reddit, and 4chan, Researchers found that far-right communities on 4chan and Reddit can have a surprising level of influence on Twitter, providing evidence that fringe communities often succeed in spreading alternative news to mainstream social networks and the greater web. No surprise to those of us who have been watching it for so long, but we'll drop off of this coverage here. I'll include the article as usual for the roundup. But just wanted you to be aware that this happens not just in Trump Russia, not just in direct Trump related news, but in anything that they care to hang their hat on, including hanging on to their guns that they love so much. All right, let's see. Other news which we've got to take the time to toss into the mix here. How about this one? Over the weekend, another thing I mentioned to you, of course, that Ivanka Trump somehow got left out of the Asia trip, which, by the way, I was amused to find. Perhaps you've seen Donald Trump on the record reviewing the success of his trip. I believe he told folks in various gaggles aboard Air Force One in between legs of the trip, on the way from China to the Philippines and on the way from from China to Vietnam and Vietnam to the Philippines. I can't recall what the order was, but at some point he is quoted in Politico as having said this, the transcript portion reading, and we had a time in China, like I guess a good time. We had a time in China. You were there. He's speaking to the reporters on board the Air Force One, which, like, this is interesting. You were there. Were most of you there? Jennifer? I don't know why he singles out Jennifer here. He wants to know if Jennifer was there. It's like, dude, they're on Air Force One with you flying from China to Vietnam. Did you think they were they just beamed themselves on board like Star Trek? I wasn't there, but I'm here now. And of course, she just answers, were most of you there, Jennifer? We all were, sir. I wonder whether there's an eye roll behind this. But this is the great part. They say, in the history of people coming to China, which of course he says China, there's been nothing like that. And I believe it. I, for one, believe him. Right? Sorry to contact on that one, but can you believe this one? Wow. In the history, it's not the history of presidents visiting China. It's the history of people coming to China. In the history of living tissue, what? There's never been a more, what? Exactly. There's never been anything like it. Yeah, there's never been a dumber person sent on behalf of the United States of America to visit a important geopolitical antagonist. Really, we've never done anything worse for ourselves. And, his performance there was horrible, obviously, but I love the review. And then he's got another one out there, too, which he says the whole Asia trip, there was a red carpet out for us, like, I think, like no president or no person ever before. He thinks he was received as, the next Genghis Khan. He conquered Asia. He did. By showing up and allowing them to play. And they play that song with the trumpets, Hail to something. And then I go out, Hail to the boss. I think that's it. And I go out and there's carpets and they're red. And no living organism in the history of history has ever had. So, okay. Just more of the same, I guess. Anyway, so yes, Ivanka got left out of it, and I'm sure that she's upset about that because in the history of histories, nobody has ever seen better stuff, and I missed it all, and she doesn't speak like him. But anyway, what's she been up to? I noticed, for instance, that she was tweeting out, this coming week, I will be in New York, New Jersey, that will be this week, and on the Hill in D.C., believe it or not, working with members of Congress to make tax reform a reality. Now, you might wonder why she's being sent to anything at all, but I'm just pleased for her that she found something to do. She's got a job. But I got a great answer from John Perr, who says, yes, Ivanka's got a job, and the pay is great. And guess what? He tells us all about what the situation is over at Daily Kos. And this is Daily Kos Radio, so it makes good sense. The GOP's top priority, he writes, giving the Trump clan a multi-billion-dollar tax cut. That's how come the pay is so great. Let's see if we can fit as much of this as possible in before we hand the microphones over. Republican leaders in Congress may not be ready to abandon Donald Trump, but there's little doubt about their growing discomfort with the President of the United States. supposedly shocked by Trump's coddling of white supremacists in the wake of the violence in Charlottesville, Virginia. Tennessee Senator Bob Corker questioned Trump's ability to either demonstrate the stability or competence required of presidents. A sheepish House Speaker Paul Ryan told the CNN town hall that Trump messed up in his handling of neo-Nazi thuggery in Virginia and proclaimed this bigotry is counter to all this country stands for. Of course, there's Mitch McConnell and his distance from him as well. But with, this is from a while back, but I guess with the summer recess set to end and tax reform, as they like to call it, on the horizon, everyone was falling back in line. And of course, as it turns out, the chief beneficiary of all of the so-called tax reform, and we can go through it one of these days this week, we ought to do it, to show exactly how many times, golly gee whiz, we've just flipped 10 heads in a row in our heads versus tails contest, and every single time it comes up with a tax break that would specifically benefit the Trump family. And so, essentially, what John is arguing here, and I'll include the article for you so you can get his perspective on it, every bit of this proposed tax reform package puts money in the Trump pockets. So, yeah, she's got a job, and she doesn't take pay for her White House job. All she does is spend her time lobbying for a tax cut that will stuff her wallet. Her dad's, hers, her brother's. The pay really is pretty good when you think about it. I wonder how much she's making per hour. Well, anyway, so we do have to hand the mics over in just a few minutes. And as you know, we had the much anticipated debut in mind of Justice's revamped program. But guess what happened? He's been hit hard by the flu. I have dispatched Greg Dworkin to his bedside to see what we can do about getting him back up on his feet. But it's still going to take some time. These things happen. And so we're going to delay the launch of his new show probably for the balance of the week. But some word still to come on what you can expect for the rest of the programming day here on Netroots Radio. And like I said, we'll spend the rest of the week hopefully getting back to some of the specifics about the tax reform still looming out there, wondering whether there's still no indication. Nobody's got anything on the record about any Senate Republicans balking on this thing, despite their being appalled at Trump and his actions and the fate of the party, etc. But as you figured, they're all inclined to fall in line for tax cuts, even if they're poorly targeted and upside down. There is also news, by the way, with all of these unqualified judicial nominations. Just want to remind you of two things. One, that any three of the half dozen or so senators who are regularly quoted or at least referred to in the newspapers as having such qualms about the Trump administration and what he's doing to the party, any three of them could put a stop to any one or all of these unqualified judicial nominees. But instead, they appear to be on board rubber stamping every single one of them. That's very troubling. It's certainly not going to get any better on the question of taxes. On the other hand, the situation in Alabama, which we will have to get back to in terms of the politics at some point, and I do have an interesting contribution from Eric Postman to share with you on that I've been sitting on for far too long, just like I was sitting on our outro music for far too long. This is going to screw us up a little bit, but I've got contribution, and you know what? He sent me two, and it occurs to me now that I'm thinking about it, I have number 3 queued up to share with you. I don't know whether we ever did number 2. It's hard to remember exactly whether we played the second installment or his first installment on Alabama, but all of this happened before the Roy Moore revelations. We should be sharing this, and in the meantime, why aren't we focusing more? And I guess we're going to have to, on his Democratic opponent. Yes, why not focus on flipping this seat and changing the calculus? Yes, it's unlikely that any three, we're ever going to get our 3 people to put a stop to the judicial nomination or to the tax bill. But it gets a little more likely if all you need is 2. Wouldn't that be something we should be focusing our time on? Yes. I've been ignoring that, and the time's running out for changing that. We'll have to put our minds to it and talk a little bit more about what can be done, what Daily Kos is doing that you can participate in, and essentially it comes down to this: send money. That's all that really can be done at this point. Going down there and volunteering, I don't know whether we're going to be able to find people from up here who are going to make sense down there. Put the money in the hands of the people who are already down there and know what to do. We'll talk more about it this week.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Thank you for listening. Yes, do donate to Doug Jones. I am certain that when we speak with Joan McCarter later this week, she will make a real point of pointing people to how they can participate through Daily Kos and doing that. You know we're going to be a part of that effort. You can join us there. Put your money together with your friends and make a difference. We'll be back tomorrow.